Imagine a world teetering on the edge of chaos, where nations were shattered, economies collapsed, and millions were desperate for hope. Amid this turmoil, a man rose from obscurity, a man whose name would become synonymous with darkness, ambition, and unimaginable power. Adolf Hitler, a man who would not only reshape Germany, but leave an indelible mark on the entire world. But who was this man, really? Was he simply a product of his time, or a force that changed history forever? Today, we will take you on a journey through the life of Hitler, from his mysterious early years, through the horrors of war, to his rise as one of history's most infamous leaders. We will explore how a single man's vision, fanaticism, and obsession could plunge the world into one of its darkest chapters. It was a Europe struggling to recover from the devastation of World War I, a continent racked by political instability, economic collapse, and deep resentment. In this fractured world, Hitler found his path, shaped by both his ambitions and the turbulent era around him. Stay with us, because in the next 2 hours, we will uncover the story behind the man behind the swastika, the circumstances that allowed him to rise, and the consequences of his reign, a story filled with ambition, cruelty, and tragedy. This is not just history. This is the story of one of the most compelling and terrifying figures the world has ever known. Adolf Hitler was born on April 20th, 1889, in the small Austrian town of Braunau am Inn, near the German border. He entered the world during a time of relative peace in Europe, but his early life would be marked by personal struggles and family tensions that would shape the man he would become. Hitler was the fourth of 6 children born to Alois Hitler and Clara Pölzl. Of these 6 children, only Adolf and his younger sister Paula survived into adulthood, a tragedy that would leave a deep impression on the young boy. His father, Alois, was a stern and often harsh man, a customs official who demanded discipline and obedience. He was strict to the point of cruelty, often clashing with Adolf's sensitive and artistic temperament. Clara, by contrast, was gentle, nurturing, and deeply devoted to her children. Her love provided a rare source of comfort in a childhood otherwise dominated by her husband's rigid expectations. From an early age, Hitler showed signs of both brilliance and defiance. He was highly intelligent, but his personality was complex, introverted, moody, and fiercely independent. School life was a mixture of success and struggle. He was good at subjects that interested him, like history and art, but he had a rebellious streak that often got him into trouble with teachers. He despised the rigid structure of formal schooling, preferring instead to immerse himself in his own studies and creative pursuits. Even as a boy, Hitler displayed an early ambition to rise above mediocrity, fueled by a fascination with German nationalism and a desire for recognition. He idolized heroic figures from German history, often immersing himself in tales of courage, battle, and glory. These stories would ignite a passion for German identity and cultural pride that would influence his world view throughout his life. One of Hitler's earliest ambitions was to become an artist. He was captivated by painting and drawing, spending hours sketching buildings, landscapes, and portraits. His artistic dreams led him to apply to the prestigious Academy of Fine Arts Vienna in 1907 and again in 1908. Both times, he was rejected, a failure that crushed him emotionally and fueled a growing resentment toward those he perceived as obstacles to his success. In Vienna, Hitler's worldview began to take shape. He wandered the streets of the city, absorbing its culture, but also developing prejudices that would later define his ideology. During his time in Vienna, Hitler encountered the ideas of German nationalism, anti-Semitism, and social Darwinism. These early influences were a dangerous mix for a young, ambitious mind. He read voraciously, devouring books on history, politics, and race theory. He became enthralled by the idea that nations and peoples were locked in a struggle for survival and dominance. This worldview, coupled with personal frustrations and repeated failures, laid the groundwork for the extremist beliefs that would later define his political career. Yet Hitler's early life was not solely defined by intellectual pursuits or ideological leanings. He also experienced profound personal loss. His beloved mother, Clara, died of breast cancer in 1907, an event that devastated him and left a void in his emotional life. This loss contributed to his sense of isolation, and for years he would live a somewhat aimless existence in Vienna, struggling to find meaning and direction. In summary, Hitler's early life was a complex blend of family tension, personal ambition, artistic dreams, and ideological awakening. From the rigid authority of his father to the nurturing love of his mother, from artistic rejection to ideological exposure, each experience shaped the young man who would later step onto the world stage with ambitions that would have catastrophic consequences. By the time he left Vienna, Hitler was a man of contradictions, sensitive yet ruthless, idealistic yet extremist, dreaming of greatness but hardened by failure. These early years set the foundation for a life that would change history forever. When the First World War broke out in 1914, Adolf Hitler was living in Vienna, struggling to find his place in the world. He was a young man in his mid-20s, frustrated by repeated failures in his artistic aspirations and facing an uncertain future. The war, however, provided him with an opportunity to escape personal disappointments and immerse himself in a cause far larger than himself. Hitler enlisted in the Bavarian army in August 1914, a decision that would prove formative in his development as a nationalist and political figure. He was assigned to the 16th Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment and sent to the Western Front in France and Belgium. The young Austrian, once a failed artist wandering Vienna's streets, was suddenly thrust into the chaos of modern industrial warfare. The front lines were brutal, trenches filled with mud, rats, and disease, constant shelling that shattered nerves and claimed lives, and the sight of comrades dying in horrific ways. Despite the horror, Hitler thrived in the army's structured environment. He found a sense of purpose, discipline, and belonging that had been absent in his civilian life. The camaraderie of soldiers, the clarity of orders, and the visible enemy gave him a framework for understanding the world in simple terms of loyalty, duty, and struggle. It was here that Hitler's nationalism deepened, and his identity as a German patriot solidified. Hitler proved to be a diligent and courageous soldier. He served primarily as a message runner, carrying dispatches between command posts under dangerous conditions. This role exposed him repeatedly to artillery fire and enemy attack, yet he performed his duties with notable bravery. On several occasions, Hitler was wounded. In October 1916, he suffered a leg injury from a shell fragment, and in October 1918, he was temporarily blinded by a mustard gas attack. These injuries earned him sympathy and recognition from his peers. Hitler's valor did not go unnoticed by his superiors. He received the Iron Cross, second class, in 1914, and the prestigious Iron Cross, first class, in 1918, a rare award for someone of his rank. These decorations reinforced his self-image as a disciplined and heroic figure, someone capable of courage and loyalty to his nation. The war, in essence, transformed Hitler from a frustrated, aimless young man into a committed, disciplined, and ideologically charged nationalist. The experience of combat left a lasting impression on Hitler's psyche. He developed a deep-seated hatred for those he considered responsible for Germany's hardships and failures. The sense of betrayal by politicians, intellectuals, and certain social groups, which he would later channel into his political ideology, had its roots in the wartime environment. He witnessed firsthand the chaos, suffering, and death brought about by war, and yet he also saw it as a crucible for forging strength and national unity. When the war ended in November 1918, Germany was a nation in turmoil. The defeat of the Central Powers, the signing of the humiliating Treaty of Versailles, and the collapse of the German Empire left the country politically, economically, and socially destabilized. Millions of German soldiers returned home to unemployment, poverty, and resentment. Inflation began to rise, and political uprisings, both from communist and nationalist factions, threatened to plunge the country into chaos. Hitler, like many veterans, returned to this unstable Germany, disillusioned and embittered. He believed that the German people had been stabbed in the back by politicians, socialists, and Jews who, in his view, had betrayed the army and the nation. This narrative, later called the stab in the back myth, would become a central component of his political ideology. The humiliation of defeat, combined with the economic hardships and social unrest of post-war Germany, created a fertile ground for radical ideas. In this post-war context, Hitler's political consciousness began to take shape. He became involved with the German Workers' Party, Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, DAP, in 1919, initially as an intelligence agent for the army. His task was to monitor political groups and report on potential threats to national security. However, it did not take long for Hitler to be drawn in by the party's message and vision. The DAP, a small nationalist and anti-Semitic organization, promoted ideas of German revival, opposition to the Treaty of Versailles, and the preservation of racial purity. Hitler quickly proved himself as an effective orator and propagandist. His speeches, delivered with passion and intensity, resonated with a population disillusioned by defeat and instability. He had unique ability to articulate the frustrations of ordinary Germans, blaming external forces for the country's suffering while promising renewal and national glory. His style was emotional, theatrical, and persuasive, qualities that would later define the mass rallies and propaganda campaigns of the Nazi Party. By 1920, Hitler had become a full member of the DAP, and the party soon rebranded itself as the National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, or the Nazi Party. Hitler's influence within the party grew rapidly. He took control of propaganda efforts, organized meetings, and developed a vision for the party's future. His ideas were radical yet simple: a strong, centralized state, the expansion of German territory, the exclusion of Jews and other undesirable elements, and the restoration of Germany to its former greatness. It is important to understand that Hitler's radicalization during this period was a combination of personal experiences and the broader context of post-war Germany. His time as a soldier instilled discipline, nationalism, and a sense of mission. The humiliation of defeat and the chaos of the Weimar Republic fueled resentment and anger, and his engagement with nationalist and anti-Semitic ideologies gave him a framework through which to interpret Germany's problems and envision a path to redemption. Hitler's rise within the DAP was also facilitated by his remarkable understanding of mass psychology. He recognized the power of symbols, slogans, and rallies to inspire loyalty and excitement. The swastika, the Nazi salute, and the emphasis on spectacle were all tools he would later use to unify and mobilize followers. Even in this early period, Hitler was learning the art of persuasion, manipulation, and leadership, skills that would later enable him to dominate German politics and society. By the early 1920s, Hitler had transitioned from a disillusioned veteran to a committed political revolutionary. The combination of his wartime experiences, exposure to nationalist ideology, and natural talent for oratory made him a formidable figure within the DAP. His personal narrative, a young man who had sacrificed for his country, endured hardship, and been betrayed by external forces, resonated deeply with the German populace, especially those who shared his sense of grievance and desire for national revival. In conclusion, Hitler's experiences during World War I and the immediate post-war period were foundational in shaping his political ideology and radicalization. The discipline, camaraderie, and heroism of the front lines gave him confidence and a sense of purpose. The social, economic, and political turmoil of post-war Germany provided fertile ground for extremist ideas, and his early involvement with the German Workers' Party offered a platform through which he could articulate his vision for Germany's future. By 1923, Hitler was no longer just a former soldier or aspiring artist. He had become a rising political figure, determined to transform Germany according to his vision. This period of radicalization, born of war, defeat, and ideological awakening, set the stage for the extraordinary and catastrophic events that would follow in the next decades. Understanding this phase of his life is crucial to comprehending how a young, frustrated man could evolve into one of history's most infamous leaders, capable of reshaping a nation and altering the course of the world. The early 1920s were a turbulent period in Germany. The country was struggling with the heavy burdens of the Treaty of Versailles, hyperinflation, political instability, and widespread social unrest. Amid this chaos, Adolf Hitler was emerging as a charismatic, radical, and ambitious figure, determined to reshape Germany according to his vision. His transformation from a soldier and political novice into the leader of a nascent revolutionary movement would mark the beginning of one of history's most infamous political rises. After joining the German Workers' Party, Deutsche Arbeiterpartei DAP in 1919, Hitler quickly became the face and voice of the organization. His speaking style, fiery, emotional, and theatrical, drew attention and inspired followers. But it was more than just his oratory that propelled him forward. Hitler had a keen sense of timing, understanding that Germany was a nation ripe for radical change. He knew that people were hungry for strong leadership, for someone who could channel their anger at humiliation and economic hardship into a sense of purpose and national pride. By 1920, Hitler had already begun to reshape the DAP to align more closely with his vision. The party was rebranded as the National Socialist German Workers' Party NSDAP, commonly known as the Nazi Party. This rebranding was more than symbolic. It was a strategic effort to appeal to both nationalist and socialist sentiments. Hitler sought to attract workers and the middle class, uniting them under a single nationalist and anti-Semitic ideology. He understood the power of propaganda in forging identity and loyalty, and he began meticulously crafting the party's image, rhetoric, and organizational structure. The NSDAP's ideology was rooted in several core principles that Hitler would relentlessly promote. The belief in the supremacy of the Aryan race, intense anti-Semitism, rejection of the Treaty of Versailles, and the restoration of Germany's national pride. Hitler framed Germany's defeat in World War I as a betrayal by Jews, Marxists, and other perceived internal enemies. He promoted the idea of Lebensraum, living space, which argued that Germany needed to expand territorially to secure the nation's future. These ideas, though extreme, were presented as solutions to Germany's perceived humiliation, poverty, and political fragmentation. Hitler's propaganda techniques were revolutionary in their effectiveness. He understood that people were more responsive to emotion than logic, and he tailored his speeches, rallies, and literature accordingly. He used dramatic language, repetition, and theatrical gestures to convey his message. He adopted symbols like the swastika and the Nazi salute, creating visual markers that united supporters and enhanced the party's brand identity. These symbols, coupled with mass rallies and parades, created a sense of belonging and excitement among followers. Hitler's propaganda was not only persuasive, it was immersive, transforming ideology into spectacle and emotion. Another critical factor in Hitler's rise was the network of key supporters and allies who believed in his vision. Figures like Dietrich Eckart, a right-wing intellectual and mentor, introduced Hitler to influential circles in Munich. Eckart and others provided both financial backing and strategic guidance, helping Hitler to navigate the political landscape and expand the party's influence. These early supporters recognized Hitler's unique ability to mobilize people and saw in him the potential to lead a radical movement. Despite these developments, Hitler's rise was not without obstacles. The Weimar Republic, though unstable, still maintained mechanisms to suppress radical uprisings. In 1923, Hitler and the Nazi leadership decided to test their strength with a direct action, what would become known as the Beer Hall Putsch. On November 8, 1923, Hitler and hundreds of armed followers stormed the Bürgerbräukeller, a large beer hall in Munich where Bavarian officials were gathered. Hitler declared the start of a revolution, intending to overthrow the local government and eventually march on Berlin. The Beer Hall Putsch, however, was poorly planned and disastrously executed. Government forces quickly responded, and the march through Munich ended in a brief but violent confrontation. 16 Nazi members were killed, along with 4 policemen. Hitler was arrested, charged with treason, and sentenced to 5 years in Landsberg prison, though he would serve less than a year. The putsch was a failure in immediate terms, but it marked a turning point in Hitler's strategy and political thinking. Imprisonment offered Hitler a unique opportunity. Rather than breaking his spirit, it provided him with the time to reflect, plan, and articulate his ideology in writing. In prison, Hitler began working on his manifesto, Mein Kampf, My Struggle. The book, part autobiography and part political treatise, outlined his worldview, his hatred of Jews and Marxists, his vision for Germany's future, and his ideas about leadership and racial hierarchy. Mein Kampf was both a personal reflection and a propaganda tool designed to solidify his beliefs and spread his ideology to a wider audience. Within the pages of Mein Kampf, Hitler recounted his experiences in Vienna and Munich, his time as a soldier in World War I, and his observations of post-war Germany. He described his perception of a Germany under threat from internal and external enemies and argued for a strong, authoritarian leadership to restore national greatness. He also detailed the strategies he would later use to gain political power: the use of propaganda, mass rallies, emotional appeals, and the cultivation of a loyal, disciplined following. While imprisoned, Hitler also developed a more strategic approach to politics. He realized that attempting a violent coup was unlikely to succeed in a country with functioning government institutions. Instead, he concluded that the Nazi Party must gain power legally through elections, propaganda, and the gradual infiltration of political structures. This shift from violent revolution to calculated political maneuvering would define Hitler's approach throughout the 1920s and 1930s. Upon his release from prison in December 1924, Hitler returned to Munich with a renewed sense of purpose and clarity. The failure of the beer hall putsch had not diminished his ambition. It had refined it. He began reorganizing the Nazi Party, focusing on building a broad-based movement that could appeal to multiple segments of German society. He emphasized party discipline, loyalty, and centralized leadership, creating a hierarchy that would later allow him to dominate the party completely. Hitler's propaganda efforts also intensified during this period. He understood the power of print media, newspapers, pamphlets, and posters to reach a mass audience. The NSDAP's publication, Völkischer Beobachter, People's Observer, became a key vehicle for spreading Nazi ideology. Hitler also expanded his speaking tours, traveling across Bavaria and beyond to deliver speeches that emphasized nationalism, anti-Semitism, and opposition to the Weimar Republic. His ability to connect with audiences, evoke emotion, and present himself as Germany's savior won him increasing support. By the late 1920s, the Nazi Party had transformed from a small fringe group into a rapidly growing political force. Membership numbers rose, and the party began to establish local branches, youth organizations, and paramilitary groups like the Sturmabteilung, SA, to protect rallies and intimidate opponents. Hitler's strategic focus on propaganda, organization, and public spectacle allowed the party to gain visibility and credibility. This period also witnessed Hitler cultivating alliances with industrialists, military officers, and nationalist organizations. These relationships provided financial support, strategic advice, and political legitimacy. Hitler learned to navigate the corridors of power, recognizing the importance of influential backers in securing his movement's success. The combination of charismatic leadership, ideological clarity, organizational discipline, and strategic alliances positioned Hitler and the Nazi Party as a significant political presence by the early 1930s. In retrospect, the rise of the Nazi Party during this period illustrates the interplay of personal ambition, historical context, and ideological innovation. Hitler's experiences in World War I, his radicalization, and his strategic thinking after the beer hall putsch created a leader who could articulate the frustrations of millions and channel them into a coherent, albeit dangerous, political movement. The publication of Mein Kampf not only codified his beliefs, but also served as a blueprint for the future expansion of the Nazi Party. By the time Hitler resumed full political activity after prison, he had become a disciplined, calculating, and ideologically driven leader. The failure of the putsch had taught him valuable lessons about timing, strategy, and the need for popular support. His reorganization of the NSDAP, mastery of propaganda, and cultivation of loyal followers laid the groundwork for the dramatic rise to power that would follow in the coming decade. Ultimately, the rise of the Nazi Party in the 1920s was not simply the story of a single man's ambition. It was the story of a nation in crisis, a leader with extraordinary talent for persuasion, and an ideology that, for better or worse, captured the fears, hopes, and resentments of a generation. Hitler's journey from an obscure party member to the undisputed leader of a powerful political movement exemplifies how historical forces, personal experience, and strategic vision can converge to change the course of history. By the late 1920s, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party had established a strong base in Bavaria and were steadily gaining influence across Germany. Yet, despite the growth in membership and visibility, the party had not yet achieved national dominance. Germany, however, was about to provide the perfect storm for Hitler's ambitions. Economic instability, political fragmentation, and social unrest created fertile ground for radical solutions, and Hitler was ready to capitalize on it. The first major factor in Hitler's path to power was the economic catastrophe that struck Germany in 1929. The Great Depression, triggered by the Wall Street crash in the United States, sent shockwaves throughout the global economy. Germany, still dependent on American loans and industrial investment due to the reparations imposed by the Treaty of Versailles, was particularly vulnerable. Banks collapsed, unemployment soared, and millions of Germans faced poverty and uncertainty. Middle-class citizens, who had once been relatively secure, found themselves on the brink of destitution. Farmers and industrial workers alike suffered, and resentment against the Weimar government reached unprecedented levels. Hitler understood the power of this crisis. He and the Nazi Party framed the Depression not merely as an economic problem, but as proof of the incompetence and betrayal of the Weimar Republic. In speeches and rallies, Hitler blamed the Treaty of Versailles, Marxists, and Jews for Germany's suffering. His message resonated deeply with the populace. The country's misfortunes were not random. They were the result of deliberate sabotage and weak leadership. Hitler promised a revival of national pride, economic recovery, and a return to traditional values. By turning despair into political opportunity, he transformed the Nazi Party into a movement that millions could identify with and support. The Nazi Party's propaganda machine was key to this success. Hitler's speeches, which combined dramatic theatrics with emotional appeals, were broadcast through newspapers, posters, and party publications. The NSDAP's paramilitary wing, the SA, Sturmabteilung, helped enforce party discipline and protect rallies, projecting strength and discipline to potential voters. Hitler understood the psychological impact of mass spectacle. Large rallies with precise choreography, banners, flags, and marching troops created a sense of unity and inevitability, suggesting that the Nazi Party was not just a political movement, but a movement of history itself. As the economic crisis deepened, political instability intensified. Frequent changes in government and ineffective coalitions eroded public confidence in the democratic process. The Weimar Republic, already fragile, appeared incapable of solving Germany's problems. Political extremism, both left and right, gained traction. The Communist Party, KPD, and the Social Democrats vied for influence, while conservative elites feared a socialist revolution. Into this chaotic environment stepped Hitler, offering clarity, decisiveness, and a vision that seemed both radical and necessary to restore Germany's greatness. The pivotal moment in Hitler's path to power came in 1932, when the Nazi Party emerged as the largest party in the Reichstag, Germany's parliament. In the July elections, the NSDAP won 37.3% of the vote, gaining 230 seats. This was a dramatic increase from previous elections and signaled that the Nazis were no longer a fringe movement. They had become a major political force capable of shaping national policy. Hitler's popularity was unprecedented. He had captured the imagination of a nation desperate for change. Yet despite this success, he was not immediately appointed Chancellor. President Paul von Hindenburg, wary of Hitler's radicalism and past association with violence, initially resisted giving him executive power. Political maneuvering and backroom negotiations were critical at this stage. Conservative politicians and industrial leaders, fearing the rise of communism, began to see Hitler as a useful tool. They believed they could control him once in office, using his mass appeal to stabilize the country while keeping ultimate power in their hands. Franz von Papen, a former chancellor, played a significant role in convincing Hindenburg to appoint Hitler. Papen and other conservatives underestimated Hitler's political acumen. They did not foresee how quickly he would consolidate power and neutralize his supposed allies. On January 30, 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. This event marked the culmination of years of strategic planning, propaganda, and exploitation of economic and social crises. The appointment was presented as a compromise, a way to integrate Hitler into the existing system while controlling him. However, Hitler had no intention of being a puppet. From the moment he entered the chancellorship, he began implementing strategies to centralize authority and eliminate opposition, setting the stage for the totalitarian regime that would soon emerge. One of the first steps in consolidating power was controlling the legislative process. Hitler pushed for the Reichstag to pass measures that would expand executive authority and reduce democratic checks. The most significant event during this period was the Reichstag fire on February 27, 1933. The German parliament building was set ablaze under mysterious circumstances, and a Dutch communist named Marinus van der Lubbe was found at the scene. Hitler and the Nazis exploited the fire as evidence of a looming communist threat. Through the Reichstag fire decree passed the very next day, the government suspended civil liberties, including freedom of speech, assembly, and the press. Political opponents, particularly communists, were arrested en masse. The decree allowed Hitler to operate without legal restraint, using emergency powers to suppress dissent and intimidate rivals. Simultaneously, Hitler moved against rivals within his own party and outside it. The SA, once a powerful paramilitary organization under Ernst Röhm, had grown increasingly influential, posing a potential threat to Hitler's authority. Many within the German military and conservative elite also viewed the SA's radicalism with suspicion. To eliminate this challenge, Hitler orchestrated the Night of the Long Knives from June 30th to July 2nd, 1934. During this purge, Hitler personally ordered the execution of Röhm and other SA leaders, along with political opponents outside the party. Over 80 people were killed, consolidating Hitler's control over both the Nazi Party and the German state. The purge sent a clear message. Loyalty to Hitler was absolute, and opposition, even from former allies, would be ruthlessly eliminated. The consolidation of power continued with strategic legal maneuvers. The Enabling Act, passed on March 23, 1933, allowed Hitler to enact laws without the Reichstag's consent, effectively granting him dictatorial powers. This act was supported by intimidation, propaganda, and the absence of communist deputies who had been arrested after the Reichstag fire. With the Enabling Act, Hitler transformed the German government into a dictatorship, systematically dismantling the democratic structures of the Weimar Republic. Political parties, trade unions, and other organizations that could challenge Nazi authority were banned or absorbed into the state. Hitler's centralization of power was methodical, combining legal mechanisms with terror and psychological manipulation. Economic policy also played a crucial role in consolidating power. Hitler implemented public works programs such as the construction of the Autobahn, which created jobs and stimulated the economy. These measures, combined with nationalist rhetoric, increased popular support and legitimacy. By presenting the Nazi regime as both effective and patriotic, Hitler won the allegiance of many Germans who might otherwise have opposed authoritarian rule. His ability to merge economic recovery with ideological messaging was a hallmark of his political strategy. Hitler's path to power was also marked by the careful manipulation of public perception. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels played a central role in controlling media narratives, glorifying Hitler's image and vilifying opponents. Newspapers, films, and radio broadcasts emphasized the strength, decisiveness, and moral authority of the Führer. Hitler was portrayed not merely as a political leader, but as the embodiment of Germany itself, a figure capable of restoring national honor and destiny. This cult of personality became a cornerstone of Nazi rule, ensuring widespread loyalty and minimizing dissent. Internationally, Hitler's rise caused concern but was initially underestimated. Foreign governments observed his consolidation of power with caution, often perceiving him as a domestic issue rather than a threat to global stability. The combination of legal authority, popular support, and suppression of opposition allowed Hitler to strengthen his regime without significant foreign interference. By mid-1934, Hitler had transformed from a radical agitator into the uncontested leader of Germany, poised to implement his vision of national revival and expansion. In conclusion, Hitler's path to power between 1929 and 1933 illustrates the interplay of economic crisis, political opportunism, strategic propaganda, and ruthless elimination of rivals. The Great Depression provided the conditions for mass mobilization, while the weaknesses of the Weimar Republic created opportunities for a determined and charismatic leader. Through skillful political maneuvering, exploitation of fear, and strategic use of violence, Hitler consolidated power and established a dictatorship that would dominate Germany and alter the course of world history. His rise was neither accidental nor inevitable. It was the result of deliberate planning, relentless ambition, and the exploitation of circumstances that millions of ordinary Germans could relate to, fear, or hope for. The events of this period, Reichstag fire, Enabling Act, and Night of the Long Knives, set the stage for the next phase of Hitler's rule, the establishment of a totalitarian state, aggressive militarization, and the eventual march toward global conflict. Understanding these critical years is essential to grasping how Hitler transformed a fragile democracy into a mechanism for dictatorship, laying the foundation for the horrors and devastation that would follow. By the late 1930s, Adolf Hitler had transformed Germany from a nation crippled by economic depression and political instability into a militarized and aggressive state poised to challenge the global order. Hitler's foreign policy had always been guided by the principles outlined in Mein Kampf: the need for Lebensraum, or living space, for the German people, the rejection of the Treaty of Versailles, and the ultimate goal of establishing German dominance in Europe. As he consolidated his power at home, Hitler began implementing policies designed to expand German territory, starting with neighboring countries that were strategically important or ethnically German. Hitler's first major act of aggression came with the reoccupation of the Rhineland in March 1936. In blatant violation of the Treaty of Versailles, German troops entered this demilitarized zone, facing no resistance from France or Britain. Hitler's gamble paid off. The lack of international response emboldened him and convinced him that the Allied powers were unwilling to enforce their treaties militarily. This event set a precedent for further expansion, demonstrating the effectiveness of calculated risk and political boldness. The Anschluss with Austria in March 1938 marked another critical step in Hitler's expansionist strategy. Austrian nationalists had long supported unification with Germany, and Hitler capitalized on this sentiment. German troops marched into Austria, greeted by cheering crowds, and the Union was declared without a shot being fired. This bloodless annexation boosted Hitler's popularity at home and demonstrated the appeal of his nationalist rhetoric. International condemnation was minimal, further encouraging him to pursue more ambitious territorial goals. The Sudetenland crisis later that year was a turning point in Hitler's strategy. The region, part of Czechoslovakia, had a significant ethnic German population. Hitler demanded its annexation, claiming the need to protect German minorities. The Munich Agreement of September 1938, signed by Britain, France, Italy, and Germany, permitted the annexation without Czechoslovak consent. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain famously proclaimed peace for our time, believing appeasement would satisfy Hitler. In reality, the agreement was a monumental miscalculation. Hitler's ambitions extended far beyond the Sudetenland, and the concessions only reinforced his belief that the Western powers could be manipulated through diplomacy and intimidation. The invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939, marked the beginning of full-scale World War II. Utilizing the strategy of blitzkrieg, or lightning war, Hitler deployed fast-moving mechanized units supported by airstrikes to overwhelm Polish defenses. Within weeks, Poland was defeated and Germany secured its eastern border. The Soviet Union, bound by the secret Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, invaded from the east, effectively partitioning Poland. Hitler's tactical brilliance in coordinating rapid, coordinated attacks revolutionized modern warfare and demonstrated his skill in applying military theory to real-world operations. However, his underestimation of logistical challenges and overconfidence in surprise tactics would later contribute to significant setbacks. By the spring of 1940, Hitler had launched invasions across Western Europe. Denmark and Norway fell in April, securing crucial supply routes and naval bases. In May, Germany invaded the Low Countries, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, before turning to France. Utilizing blitzkrieg once again, German forces bypassed the heavily fortified Maginot Line, advancing through the Ardennes forest in a maneuver that stunned Allied commanders. Paris fell in June 1940, and France surrendered within weeks. The rapid succession of victories cemented Hitler's reputation as a military genius and elevated the Nazi regime to the height of its power. The Battle of Britain, however, marked the first significant challenge to Hitler's strategy. In the summer and fall of 1940, the Luftwaffe launched a massive aerial campaign aimed at gaining air superiority over southern England in preparation for an invasion. Despite initial successes, British resistance, technological innovations like radar, and the resilience of the Royal Air Force thwarted German plans. The failure to subdue Britain revealed limitations in Hitler's approach: overconfidence in air power, underestimation of enemy morale, and a lack of long-term strategic planning. The setback also forced Hitler to reconsider direct invasions of Western Europe and turned his focus toward the East. In June 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, in one of the most ambitious military campaigns in history. Millions of German troops, supported by tanks, artillery, and air power, advanced across vast territories, initially achieving stunning success. Cities fell, armies were encircled, and Soviet forces suffered catastrophic losses. However, Hitler's strategic miscalculations soon became apparent. The invasion underestimated the vastness of the Soviet Union, the harshness of the Russian winter, and the resilience of the Red Army. Supply lines stretched beyond capacity, and German troops faced severe shortages of food, fuel, and ammunition. The failure to capture Moscow before winter turned the tide, leading to a protracted conflict that Germany was ill-prepared to sustain. Hitler's leadership style significantly impacted the war's course. Unlike traditional military commanders, Hitler increasingly intervened in operational planning, insisting on micromanagement of campaigns and often overruling experienced generals. While this centralized control ensured loyalty, it frequently resulted in tactical blunders. Decisions like insisting on holding Stalingrad at all costs, despite logistical impossibility, led to massive German losses and marked the beginning of a strategic decline. Hitler's ideological obsession with racial and political goals often overrode practical military considerations, further compounding the challenges faced by his forces. The entry of the United States into the war following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 further altered the strategic landscape. While Hitler's initial focus had been on Europe, he declared war on the United States, underestimating American industrial capacity and resolve. This decision opened a global front that stretched German resources and exposed the limitations of Hitler's expansionist ambitions. By 1942, Germany faced mounting challenges. The Soviet Union was regaining territory. The Allies were preparing major offensives, and internal dissent and logistical failures were increasingly evident. The North African campaign also highlighted Hitler's strategic misjudgments. The Afrika Korps, commanded by General Erwin Rommel, achieved initial victories against British forces, but supply issues and overstretched lines hindered sustained success. Hitler's insistence on diverting resources to secondary theaters weakened German positions on the primary fronts in the Soviet Union and Western Europe. Similarly, the strategic bombing of Britain, though intended to break morale, failed to achieve its objectives and diverted critical resources from more decisive campaigns. Key turning points emerged in 1942 and 1943, signaling the beginning of the end for Hitler's military dominance. The Battle of Stalingrad, fought between August 1942 and February 1943, became one of the deadliest and most decisive confrontations of the war. German forces, encircled and facing extreme winter conditions, ultimately surrendered, suffering staggering casualties. The defeat shattered the myth of invincibility that Hitler had cultivated and marked a major psychological blow to German morale. Meanwhile, the Allied victories in North Africa and the intensifying strategic bombing campaign against German industrial centers further weakened the Nazi war machine. Hitler's strategic mistakes continued with the Italian campaign and the Battle of Kursk in 1943. Overextension, refusal to retreat in the face of overwhelming odds, and ideological rigidity led to catastrophic losses. Hitler's insistence on personally directing operations and his distrust of generals undermined effective military decision-making. By mid-1943, the momentum had shifted decisively to the Allies, and Germany's prospects for victory were rapidly diminishing. In addition to military failures, Hitler's policies in occupied territories provoked resistance and diverted resources. The implementation of brutal occupation policies, mass executions, and the systematic genocide of Jews and other targeted groups fueled partisan warfare, strained logistics, and mobilized international condemnation. These actions, driven by ideological fanaticism rather than military necessity, further complicated Germany's war effort and demonstrated how Hitler's worldview directly influenced strategic outcomes. By 1944, the Allied forces had achieved significant victories on multiple fronts. The D-Day invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, marked the beginning of the liberation of Western Europe. The Soviet Union launched massive offensives on the Eastern Front, reclaiming territory and advancing toward Germany. Hitler, increasingly isolated and obsessed with maintaining control, made desperate attempts to influence the war's outcome, often issuing contradictory orders and refusing to authorize tactical retreats. His earlier successes, built on rapid offensives and audacious gambles, had been replaced by a protracted defensive struggle that Germany was ill-prepared to sustain. In summary, Hitler's leadership during World War II combined remarkable early successes with critical strategic errors that ultimately led to Germany's downfall. His expansionist policies and early victories demonstrated innovative tactics, bold decision-making, and a deep understanding of the political and psychological dimensions of warfare. Yet his ideological rigidity, overconfidence, interference in military operations, and underestimation of adversaries contributed to catastrophic failures. Major battles such as Stalingrad, Kursk, and the Normandy invasion highlighted the limits of his strategic vision, while the global mobilization of Allied forces exposed the vulnerabilities of a regime that had relied on speed, surprise, and terror to achieve dominance. Hitler's World War II campaigns serve as a stark reminder of how the ambitions of one individual, coupled with opportunistic exploitation of historical circumstances, can alter the course of history. They also illustrate the dangers of centralized power, ideological obsession, and the human cost of totalitarian ambition. Understanding these campaigns provides crucial insight into both the military and political dimensions of Hitler's rule, setting the stage for the final collapse of the Third Reich. The Holocaust remains one of the darkest chapters in human history, a systematic campaign of genocide orchestrated under Adolf Hitler's Nazi regime that claimed the lives of 6 million Jews, along with millions of others deemed undesirable, according to Nazi ideology. To understand the Holocaust, one must first grasp the ideological foundations that drove Hitler and his followers. Hitler's worldview was rooted in a virulent form of anti-Semitism, which was not merely social prejudice but a political, racial, and pseudo-scientific belief system. Jews were depicted as a malignant force responsible for Germany's defeat in World War I, economic instability, and the perceived moral decay of society. This ideology was reinforced through propaganda, education, and legislation, gradually normalizing hatred and setting the stage for mass extermination. From the early 1930s, Nazi policies targeted Jews systematically. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 legally codified racial discrimination, stripping Jews of citizenship and forbidding marriage or sexual relations between Jews and non-Jews. Jews were increasingly excluded from public life, professional positions, and cultural institutions. Propaganda campaigns in newspapers, films, and rallies depicted Jews as subhuman, dangerous, and morally corrupt. By marginalizing Jews socially, economically, and politically, the Nazis laid the groundwork for more radical measures that would follow during the war. The outbreak of World War II accelerated Nazi anti-Semitic policies and provided the opportunity to implement them on a massive scale. Initially, Jews were subjected to forced labor, expropriation of property, and deportations to ghettos in occupied territories, particularly in Poland. Ghettos, often enclosed and overcrowded, became sites of extreme suffering. Malnutrition, disease, and brutal treatment by German authorities resulted in tens of thousands of deaths even before the implementation of industrialized extermination. The conditions in ghettos, like Warsaw and Lodz, were deliberately inhumane, designed to isolate, weaken, and dehumanize the Jewish population. The ideological foundation of the Holocaust reached its most lethal stage with the development of the final solution, a plan to exterminate the Jewish population of Europe. Initiated in 1941 following the invasion of the Soviet Union, the final solution was orchestrated by high-ranking Nazi officials, including Heinrich Himmler, Reinhard Heydrich, and Adolf Eichmann. Hitler and his inner circle authorized a bureaucratically organized genocide, utilizing the machinery of the state, the SS, and other security organizations to implement a systematic program of murder. Concentration and extermination camps were established across occupied Europe, including Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec. These camps functioned as centers of mass killing, forced labor, and terror. Prisoners were transported in inhumane conditions via rail, often packed tightly into cattle cars for days with little food or water. Auschwitz-Birkenau became the most infamous of these camps, symbolizing the industrial scale of Nazi murder. Upon arrival, prisoners underwent a selection process in which those deemed unfit for labor, the elderly, children, and the sick, were sent immediately to gas chambers. Others were exploited for forced labor under conditions designed to weaken and eventually kill them. Medical experiments conducted by Nazi doctors subjected inmates to unimaginable suffering, reflecting the regime's dehumanizing ideology. The systematic use of gas chambers, crematoria, and mass shootings allowed the Nazis to murder millions efficiently, demonstrating the horrifying combination of bureaucratic organization, technological innovation, and ideological fanaticism. The Holocaust also targeted groups beyond the Jewish population: Roma, Gypsies, disabled individuals, Poles, Soviet prisoners of war, political dissidents, Jehovah's Witnesses, and homosexuals were also persecuted. These groups were considered threats to Nazi racial or ideological purity and were subjected to mass killings, forced sterilizations, and deportations. While Jews were the primary victims, the broader program of repression and extermination underscored the totalitarian and genocidal nature of Hitler's regime. The impact of the Holocaust on Europe was profound and multifaceted. Entire communities were decimated, cultural heritage destroyed, and social structures disrupted. Cities and towns that had hosted vibrant Jewish populations for centuries were left empty, their synagogues desecrated, and traditions erased. Survivors faced immense challenges in rebuilding their lives amidst trauma, loss, and displacement. The psychological scars extended far beyond Europe, influencing international understanding of human rights, genocide prevention, and the responsibilities of governments to protect vulnerable populations. The Holocaust also transformed global awareness of the potential consequences of unchecked totalitarianism and hatred. After the war, the Nuremberg trials prosecuted many Nazi officials for war crimes and crimes against humanity, establishing legal precedents for the prosecution of genocide. The world confronted the moral imperative to prevent such atrocities in the future, leading to the creation of international conventions and institutions dedicated to human rights, refugee protection, and the prevention of genocide. Hitler's ideological obsession with racial purity and anti-Semitism, therefore, left an indelible mark not only on Europe, but on global consciousness and legal frameworks. Ultimately, the Holocaust exemplifies the intersection of ideology, bureaucracy, and technological capability in the service of mass murder. Hitler's anti-Semitic vision was translated into systematic industrialized killing through meticulous planning, ruthless organization, and exploitation of state machinery. The moral and human consequences were catastrophic. Millions of lives extinguished, families annihilated, and communities erased. The atrocities committed under Hitler's regime serve as a stark warning of the dangers of unchecked hatred, authoritarianism, and ideological extremism. Understanding the Holocaust also requires grappling with the role of ordinary individuals, perpetrators, collaborators, bystanders, and rescuers, and how societal structures, propaganda, and fear can influence behavior. The Holocaust was not solely the product of Hitler's orders. It involved the complicity and participation of countless individuals, from bureaucrats to soldiers, who enabled the machinery of death. Yet it also revealed instances of courage and resistance, as some risked their lives to save others, providing critical lessons on moral responsibility and the capacity for human empathy amidst unimaginable horror. In sum, the Holocaust was the culmination of Hitler's ideological vision and the most extreme manifestation of his anti-Semitism. Its execution involved careful planning, coordination, and the use of state and technological resources to achieve mass extermination. The impact on Europe and the world was profound, reshaping demographics, culture, and collective memory while highlighting the moral imperative to confront hatred and prevent genocide. By examining the Holocaust in detail, we not only understand the depths of human cruelty, but also the enduring lessons about vigilance, justice, and the defense of human dignity in the face of tyranny. As World War II progressed into its final years, the tide turned decisively against Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. By 1943 and 1944, the strategic situation had deteriorated significantly. The German military faced defeats on multiple fronts. In the east, the Red Army regained territory lost to Operation Barbarossa and began pushing westward, reclaiming cities and inflicting heavy casualties. On the Western Front, the Allies successfully executed the D-Day landings in June 1944, establishing a foothold in Normandy and liberating France. The combined pressure of these fronts exposed the flaws in Hitler's military strategy and revealed the growing incapacity of the Nazi war machine. Hitler's leadership style, once marked by bold, if reckless offensives, now contributed to Germany's collapse. He increasingly became isolated, relying on a small inner circle and disregarding the advice of experienced generals. Micromanagement of military operations, refusal to allow retreats, and insistence on no surrender orders resulted in catastrophic losses. Strategic errors such as the failed Ardennes offensive, Battle of the Bulge, in late 1944, further depleted Germany's remaining resources and morale. Internal struggles within the Nazi regime, including power struggles among military and party leaders, compounded the crisis, leaving the country fragmented and unprepared for the inevitable Allied advance. By early 1945, Soviet forces were approaching Berlin from the east, while American, British, and French forces advanced from the west. The city itself became a fortress under siege, with civilians and soldiers alike trapped amidst relentless bombardment. Hitler retreated to his underground Führer bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, a claustrophobic and heavily fortified complex that became both his residence and command center in the war's final weeks. Life in the bunker was marked by isolation, paranoia, and a stark disconnect from reality. Reports of the collapsing fronts were filtered through advisors, often distorted to shield Hitler from the full extent of Germany's defeat, but the reality was unavoidable. The war was lost. Hitler's mental and physical state deteriorated during this period. His health declined due to chronic illness, stress, and possibly the effects of prolonged drug use as administered by his personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell. His paranoia intensified, with increasing suspicion of betrayal even among his closest aides. The once charismatic leader, capable of inspiring mass followings, now seemed obsessed with maintaining his ideological vision, even as it became clear that it was unattainable. He issued directives for scorched earth policies and last-ditch military resistance, while also arranging succession plans and final political decrees. The last days in the bunker were a mixture of grim resolve and futile planning. Hitler married Eva Braun on April 29, 1945, in a brief private ceremony, a symbolic act of defiance and personal closure amidst chaos. The following day, April 30, 1945, he and Eva Braun committed suicide together. Hitler took cyanide and also shot himself, while Eva Braun ingested cyanide. Their bodies were carried out of the bunker, doused in petrol, and partially burned in the Chancellery garden, in accordance with Hitler's instructions to avoid capture and public display by the Allies. The Führer bunker, once the center of Nazi power, became a silent testament to the collapse of the regime. The aftermath of Hitler's death marked the rapid disintegration of Nazi Germany. German forces surrendered in the following weeks, culminating in the official capitulation on May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe, VE Day. The consequences for Germany were catastrophic. Cities lay in ruins due to relentless bombing campaigns. Millions of civilians were displaced, and the country faced occupation by Allied forces. Political, social, and economic systems were shattered, and the German populace confronted the scale of destruction wrought by Hitler's policies, both during the war and through the Holocaust. Europe as a whole was transformed by the collapse of Nazi Germany. The continent faced immense challenges in reconstruction, reconciliation, and addressing the human toll of the war. Millions of refugees and survivors had to be resettled, and the process of denazification sought to remove Nazi influence from public life, including administration, education, and culture. The Nuremberg trials prosecuted leading Nazis for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, establishing historical accountability and international legal precedents. Hitler's death, while ending the reign of one of history's most infamous dictators, did not immediately heal the wounds inflicted on Europe or the world. Rather, it marked the beginning of a long process of recovery and reflection. Hitler's decline and fall illustrate the destructive consequences of ideological fanaticism, authoritarianism, and unchecked power. The trajectory from his early political rise to the catastrophic consequences of his leadership underscores the human, social, and political costs of tyranny. His final days in the bunker serve as a stark reminder of isolation, delusion, and the ultimate futility of pursuing power through violence and oppression. The world would remember Hitler not merely as a military or political figure, but as a symbol of the dangers inherent in hatred, extremism, and the absolute concentration of power. In conclusion, the final chapter of Hitler's life, the relentless Allied advances, the collapse of the Third Reich, and his ultimate suicide, represents the culmination of decades of ideology, ambition, and cruelty. Germany and Europe faced devastation, but these events also laid the groundwork for rebuilding, for confronting the legacies of fascism, and for shaping a post-war order that prioritized peace, human rights, and international cooperation. Hitler's decline and fall remain a critical subject of historical study, offering lessons about the limits of power, the consequences of moral blindness, and the enduring need for vigilance against authoritarianism in all its forms. Adolf Hitler's life and dictatorship left a mark on history that is both profound and deeply troubling. Even decades after his death, historians, scholars, and the general public continue to grapple with the questions surrounding his actions, his motivations, and the consequences of his rule. The legacy of Hitler is not just one of destruction, but also a complex narrative of ideology, psychology, and political dynamics that shaped the 20th century and beyond. One of the central aspects of Hitler's legacy lies in historical interpretation. Scholars debate the factors that allowed him to rise to power and maintain control over Germany. Some emphasize structural conditions, such as the economic devastation following World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, and the Great Depression, which created fertile ground for extremist ideologies. Others focus on Hitler's personal charisma, rhetorical skill, and ability to manipulate public sentiment through propaganda and mass rallies. The combination of societal crisis and individual agency demonstrates that historical events are rarely the result of a single factor, but emerge from a web of interconnected circumstances. Hitler's dictatorship also provokes reflection on human psychology and the susceptibility of populations to authoritarian leaders. His use of propaganda, scapegoating, and appeals to nationalism exploited fears, prejudices, and desires for stability among the German people. The cult of personality he cultivated created an environment where dissent was dangerous and loyalty was demanded. Studying this dynamic helps illuminate broader patterns in political behavior and the potential dangers of unchecked power, demonstrating that social, economic, and psychological conditions can converge to produce catastrophic outcomes. The ethical and moral lessons derived from Hitler's actions remain critical for contemporary society. The Holocaust, systematic persecution of Jews, Romani people, disabled individuals, and other marginalized groups, represents one of history's darkest chapters. It underscores the consequences of dehumanization, hatred, and ideological extremism. The crimes committed under Hitler's rule led to the development of international laws regarding genocide, human rights, and crimes against humanity, serving as a global framework for accountability. Reflection on these lessons is essential to prevent repetition of such atrocities and to foster vigilance against emerging forms of prejudice and authoritarianism. Controversy also surrounds the portrayal and discussion of Hitler. While there is widespread consensus condemning his actions, the nuances of his personality and leadership continue to generate debate. Some historians analyze his strategic decisions, leadership style, and administrative methods to understand how he achieved and maintained power. Others caution against over-intellectualizing his persona, emphasizing that focusing too much on Hitler as an individual can distract from the systemic, societal, and institutional factors that enabled the rise of Nazism. Balancing these perspectives is critical for an accurate understanding of history. Moreover, Hitler's legacy prompts reflection on the power of ideology. His belief in racial purity, anti-Semitism, and expansionist nationalism drove policies that devastated millions of lives. Understanding the seductive appeal of such ideologies is key to recognizing how they can emerge in different contexts even today. The study of Hitler's propaganda techniques, use of symbolism, and manipulation of mass media provides insight into how ideas can shape societies and influence political outcomes. It serves as a cautionary tale for citizens, educators, and policymakers about the necessity of critical thinking, media literacy, and moral responsibility. Finally, the legacy of Hitler forces societies to confront the long-term consequences of war, extremism, and totalitarianism. Germany itself underwent a profound transformation after the fall of the Third Reich. Post-war reconstruction, denazification, and the establishment of democratic institutions marked an effort to learn from past mistakes and rebuild a society based on principles of justice and human dignity. Globally, the Second World War reshaped international relations, led to the founding of the United Nations, and influenced decades of geopolitical strategy during the Cold War. Hitler's life, therefore, is not only a study of a dictator, but also a lens through which the consequences of extreme power, moral failure, and collective responsibility can be examined. In conclusion, Hitler's legacy is a multifaceted and deeply instructive subject. It encompasses historical interpretation, ethical reflection, political analysis, and psychological insight. His rise and fall provide enduring lessons about the dangers of authoritarianism, the power of ideology, and the vulnerability of societies during periods of crisis. By studying Hitler and his impact, humanity is reminded of the critical importance of vigilance, empathy, and accountability. Remembering the atrocities of his regime ensures that the past informs the present and guides the future toward a world that values human life, equality, and justice. As we reach the end of Adolf Hitler's story, it's clear how one individual, combined with turmoil and fear, can change the world, sometimes for the worst. His rise and fall show the dangers of hatred, propaganda, and unchecked ambition. Hitler's life challenges us to ask, how do societies allow extremist ideas to grow? How can we resist manipulation and protect justice and humanity? His legacy is a reminder that freedom and morality must be actively preserved. Think about this. If you lived in Hitler's Germany, what would you have done? What steps can we take today to prevent such leaders from gaining power? History is not just about the past. It's a warning for our future.